But it's a pleasure to welcome everybody today to the 2022 Milton Konvitz lecture given today by Basil Smikle. I'm Alex Colvin, the Kenneth F. Kahn Dean and Martin F. Scheinman Professor in the ILR School. And it's a pleasure to welcome those here in person today. And I believe there's something like 170 people online in this great spirit of our time. I do want to thank you all for coming and participating, and particularly want to thank Erwin and Joan Jacobs, who could not be here in person, but are watching from home in California. The Jacobs have been extraordinary benefactors of many important causes throughout the world, including many at Cornell. Their support for the university includes scholarships, fellowships, and professorships in the colleges of engineering and human ecology, the Joan and Erwin Jacobs Technion Cornell Institute at Cornell Tech, and this lecture here at ILR, for which we are very grateful. This is ILR's signature lecture and honors a founding member of the ILR faculty, Professor Milton Konvitz. This lecture was endowed by the Jacobs in 2005 to honor the spirit of Professor Konvitz's theoretically rich and diverse course, American Ideals. Dr. Jacobs and generations of students, estimates suggest something around 8,000 students took this course at ILR. It was essentially a university course before we had the idea of such a course. There's now a link on ILR's webpage where you can actually download and listen to a recording of an entire semester of this course. So if you're looking for something beyond the typical podcast, I strongly recommend it. It's quite amazing to listen to Professor Konvitz's voice on the download. The Konvitz lecture brings a prominent expert in American democratic thought, ethics, or political philosophy to speak here to the campus community. Previous lecturers have included John Ruggie, Sandra Day O'Connor, Cass Sunstein, Charles Ogletree, Ken Feinberg, and Wilma Liebman, all in honor of Professor Konvitz, who was born at the beginning of the last century in 1908. He emigrated to the United States in 1915 and became a citizen of this country in 1926. He received his bachelor's and law degrees in 1930 from NYU and his PhD in philosophy from Cornell in 1933. Professor Konvitz was not only a remarkable teacher, but also a scholar and citizen. He was an authority on constitutional and labor law and on civil and human rights. He served on the faculty here in ILR and law from 1946 until 1973 and passed away in 2003 at the age of 95. He was also a devoted public servant of our university, including serving as the founder of the university's Department of Near East Studies and its program of Jewish Studies. And now I'd like to introduce our lecturer today, Basil Smikle, ILR class of 93. Proud to have him as one of our alumni. Dr. Smikle is a distinguished lecturer and director of the public policy program at the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. He also lectures at Columbia University in the School of International and Public Affairs and Teachers College. With over 15 years in higher education and 25 years of a career dedicated to public service, Basil regularly shares insights on electoral politics, governance, and public policy on national media outlets such as MSNBC, CNN, and Bloomberg TV. He holds his PhD in politics and education and an MPA from Columbia University, and previously served as Distinguished Lecturer of Politics and Public Policy at the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies. He was appointed by former Governor David Paterson to serve as the executive director of the New York State Democratic Party during the 2016 presidential cycle, where he was the second highest ranking Democrat in the state. Basil worked closely with elected officials and community leaders to manage electoral and fundraising strategies for the state. He recruited candidates for political office and worked closely with the Democratic National Committee to create grassroots mobilization programs and acting as a party surrogate. Under his leadership, Democrats flipped county legislatures and county-wide seats, laying the foundation for returning the state Senate to full Democratic control in 2018 and flipping 3 congressional seats. He received awards from the governor and the comptroller of New York State for his commitment to public service and education equity. It's a great pleasure to welcome back a very distinguished alumnus of the school, and we're very much looking forward to his lecture today. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Wonderful. It is good to be here and be with you in a universe where Elon Musk now owns Twitter. So hello, everybody. Hello to all of you and to those viewing remotely. First and foremost, I wanted to really just say thank you. Thank you to Dean Colvin and to Dean Sellen for all of the, for first the invitation, but also the support in coming here today. It was really amazing for me to get that email to ask me to give this lecture today. What I don't want to do is go forward without telling you a little bit about who I am. It's really not self-serving, I promise you that. It's really an opportunity to get you to understand the lens through which I see public policy and politics, right? So my parents are, I'm gonna come out in front. I hope I'm not throwing off the camera angle. My parents are Jamaican immigrants. They came to this country in 1970. My father is a retired textile worker. My mother is a school teacher, UFT member, school teacher for about 30 years, and she taught special ed in the New York City public school system. So you can imagine what that's like. My grandmother also lived with us, and I shared a bed with my grandmother until I was maybe 7, 8 years old. Different bed, same room, until I graduated from Cornell, actually. As much as my mother tried to shield me from the ills of the neighborhood at the time, this is early 80s, mid 80s. She sent me to Catholic school, so I've basically dressed like this since I was 6 years old. And still proudly do. Shoes that can hold a shine, hair not too bald on the side when flat tops were popular, but that's another story. No facial hair, so I'm clearly rebelling now. But sent me to Catholic school 1st through 12th grade. But it was still a very difficult time in the neighborhood. At that point, crack was sort of blossoming, if you can call it that. It was booming in the neighborhood. And a guy who dropped out of junior high school, he dropped out of 7th grade, kept trying to recruit me to sell drugs for him, and I refused and kept refusing. And we got into a verbal confrontation and he shot me. I was 12. Needless to say, I didn't go out for a while afterwards. I decided that it was time to really get a strong, good education. And I put my shoulder to the wheel, I'm mixing metaphors, shoulder to the grindstone, wherever the thing, and was able to come here to Cornell. And it wasn't an easy time. There's students here, so hey guys, I know, just as for you, right? Wasn't an easy time. Came here not really understanding what my role, what place was gonna be. I was on food stamps the whole 4 years I was here, as were a number of my friends. And we reflect on that time now, because we say to each other that we were smart but under-resourced. And in fact, we didn't know how much we didn't know about what it meant to be here. It was like here that you can actually go to a professor just to ask questions. Really? You could do that? We didn't, this seemed foreign to us. But we made, and we were able to survive, if you will. But we want to do just more than survive, right? And from that experience, I went on to do all the other stuff that's in the resume and in the bio. But I talk about this because this experience really did shape so much of how I view the world. And having said that, I do want to thank all of the folks who helped me get through this. And I want to start, because I see her there, Professor Risa Leibowitz. Thank you so very much for all that you've done. Dean James McPherson, who has sadly left us many years ago, but he was an incredible force for me. Laura Lewis, who I guess is your acting mayor now, the city of Ithaca. So she was here and very tremendous and supportive of me. And Barry Taylor and Martha Smith, who were instrumental in getting me to sort of be able to navigate this space. So to all of you, Professor Boyer, who was here, came up to me about an hour ago and said, hey, remember me? I said, of course I remember you. Of course I do. Professor Gold, who I'll speak in your class tomorrow morning. Is that right? Speaking in your class tomorrow morning? Okay, I hope you didn't forget. I didn't forget. I got a whole thing planned out. And Professor Salvatore, if you're here, Again, for all of you, thank you so much for everything that you've given to me. So why are we here today? What do I want to talk about today? This new voices and new venues. I want to start with actually what it meant to come up here. I drove up here yesterday, and I saw through a stretch of Pennsylvania, and even once I crossed the border back into New York, all these Trump signs. And I said, but by the way, I don't want to make this a fully partisan conversation. Progressive, I'm a Black man, so I got to be progressive, right? Because I am. But I don't want to make this a partisan conversation, because this is about how we move forward, right? Having said that, so all Trump signs. And it's interesting to me because I don't see Biden signs at all. Right? Don't see Hillary signs. But I did, for a good period of time, see a lot of Obama signs. But it reminded me of that. It reminded me that, number one, there's still a good percentage of this country that aligns themselves with President Trump. What it also means to me is that what we're experiencing there, what we're experiencing now, is not an anomaly. It's actually a movement. It's a political movement. Presidential campaigns are about creating social and political movements. Obama had one, right? What was Obama's message?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can, and what else? There's hope and change. See, you remember that, right? There's a reason you remember that, because it touched you in a certain way. Bernie Sanders, right? A lot of Bernie fans here? All right. Bernie had a strong message. What was Bernie about? Affordable college, Medicare. Those things resonate with you. There's a reason that you remember it. And the concern that I have is that if you care about politics and policy today, where is our social movement today? Where's the center of that? Who's leading that? And there's some of those points I want to talk about a little bit today. But if I think about the flags that I saw, and the fact that there were some that are still tattered and torn, so they've been up since 2016. And I could say that maybe people forgot to take them down, but I doubt that. I saw a couple for 2020, didn't see for 2024, but I probably will see those soon, or maybe I wasn't looking hard enough. But for me, all of what we're seeing now started for me back in 2016 on CNN, and got into terrible arguments with folks across the table. And it came to a point where I said, this is not who I am. This is not me. This is not my style. This is not why I decided to do this work, because all I'm doing is arguing. All I'm doing is being angry, and that's not a good look. Having said that, one of the change dynamic was that as we were finishing our segments and we would leave the building, they started to make sure that security guards were in the building because of the threat of. I'm just a commentator. I'm not an elected official. I'm not out here making policy, although I've done that. But I'm just talking about what's going on in the world. And yet they felt the need to make sure that we had security guards to walk us out the door. And that was incredibly shocking, surprising to so many of us. But I remember somewhere in that time in 2016, I remember sitting at a dinner. It was at a restaurant. I was across the table from and I was in a very liberal part of Manhattan. If you don't know Manhattan, there's some really liberal parts of Manhattan. And I was at a dinner with a friend in that neighborhood. And I remember some folks at the table next to me saying, yeah, I may not like Donald Trump, but what about this immigration stuff though? We got to fix that. Or, maybe Donald Trump isn't the most articulate person, but the media is really going after him, especially that thing he said about the guns, if you remember that. It's where I can shoot anybody on, right? And they were complaining about the way he was being treated in the media. This is a liberal, aggressive, right? And I remember that because it resonated with me, because I said at that moment, something's different. Something's changed. Something's changed in our atmosphere. It's changed in our political conversation. And I'm not sure we have an answer for it. And it's interesting because I was doing some research for this lecture and I found a quote by U11 from AEI, and that's the American Enterprise Institute. It's center right. I don't agree with his conclusions, but there's something he said that I thought I should share with you today. He said, our culture war plainly lacks boundaries. Every realm of our lives has become one of its battlefields, not only in politics, but also in schools, in universities, in corporate America, in our places of worship, in our places of work, in civil society, and in our private lives, online and in person. There's often just no getting away from that intense, divisive, and rigidly partisan struggle. The particular disputes over which we are supposed to be at each other's throats constantly shift and change. Sometimes it's race and policing. Sometimes immigration and borders. Sometimes American history or education. Cancel culture, or some burgeoning fascism, free speech, or hate speech workism. But it works. This works. We are finding fewer and fewer boundaries for this kind of discourse. And I'll give you a quick example. I usually say he who should not be named, but Andrew Cuomo, our former governor. On his Mea Culpa tour, goes to a Black church, because that's what people do when they go on Mea Culpa tours. First stop. And what does he do? He decries cancel culture as one of the driving forces behind him having to leave office. And I said, look at that. An investigation by a sitting attorney general, an African-American woman that he helped put in that office. He's now going into a neighborhood in front of Black voters and talking about cancel culture. Investigation. But this is cancel culture. Why would he feel the need to do that? Because he feels it works. That people are fed up. They're fed up with wokeism, that he can spark some feeling and sentiment in the suburbs, perhaps. But the concern is that if you have a Democrat going around talking about we've got to end cancel culture, and you're sort of adopting, think about what that is, frankly. It's adopting Trumpian type tactics, right? For however you feel about either of them, it's about adopting that set of tactics and implementing it in this new environment. And that is also concerning to me. So are we backsliding? Is this small d democratic backsliding? Well, according to the Global State of the Democracy report, quote, the number of countries moving in an authoritarian direction outnumbered those going in a democratic direction. It's about 20. Democratically elected governments are increasingly adopting authoritarian tactics. Democratic backsliding has often enjoyed significant popular support, and it's deepening in non-democratic regimes as well. If you think about what's happened in the pandemic, it the pandemic had a particularly damaging effect on non-democratic regimes. Further closing already reduced civic space. There goes that point about civic space again. Civic space, how and what we gather, how we gather, where we gather, what we say to each other, this is now all being affected, right? How many of you don't want to have conversations around the dinner table anymore, right? Not afraid, but concerned about going home for the holidays because you don't want to get into certain conversations. I know that with many of my friends, I step away from certain conversations. I know I'm right, but yeah. I step away from some of these conversations as well. It's concerning, and it's affected so many other aspects of our lives. And this is what's new about what we're experiencing today. But of course, in focusing on the United States, it is clear that the United States, from this research, that the United States, for the first time, was added to these backsliding democracies. According to the Washington Post, the United States the bastion of global democracy fell victim to authoritarian tendencies itself, and was knocked down a significant number of steps on the democratic scale. Let me add to that, 75% of the world's population now lives in countries experiencing democratic declines. So again, I stress this point about reduced civic space, because if we believe, and I believe, that in the value of widespread citizen participation and how necessary it is for all citizens to possess the equal opportunity to participate, then what are we seeing in this country? What are we seeing in other countries? Not just the reduced opportunity to participate, but even for those that do, incredible inequality there. So it's not just issues, and I did touch on partisan politics before, I'll touch on it again. While polarization was seen as issue-based, it is now also party divisions, and we know this, right? How many times have we heard stats or anecdotal evidence that my party hates your party, those folks hate us, right? And are we ever going to get out of that cycle? We know that gerrymandering has a lot to do with that. But again, the average voter may not know what gerrymandering really is and means, but they know how it feels. They know how it feels. In fact, Steve Israel, who runs the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs here, has fond of saying that you can basically tell a community by whether or not it has a Whole Foods or a Cracker Barrel. Do you know this? If it has a Whole Foods, it's likely Democratic leaning, a Cracker Barrel likely Republican leaning. If it has both, it's purple. I happen to like Cracker Barrel too, by the way. They have great rolls. But the thing, we're sorting ourselves, or have been sorted, to live in these communities, to live in these neighborhoods where we can anticipate the kinds of conversations that we have with our neighbors. We get to sort of engage and mix with others. We're increasingly not doing that. And that affects what is called the affective polarization of our country. Do you need to change something?
I apologize.
That's quite all right.
We'll ask you to put on this mic so it's getting a little bit of feedback, but that was cutting in slightly.
Technical difficulties.
So appreciate the swap.
How does now? Getting it?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Given what I just mentioned, how does the media fit into this? Let me ask you all a question. Where do you get your news from?
New York Times.
New York Times.
Twitter.
Well, Elon Musk is now controlling it. Where else?
Washington Post.
Washington Post. Every day?
More or less.
More or less? You're a student, right? You got to say every day. Every day. Okay. Anybody else?
CNN.
Regularly? Okay. Anybody else?
Wall Street Journal, reluctantly.
Reluctantly.
Fox.
And the
Fox News.
and Fox News, CNN, and go ahead.
BBC.
Love the BBC. Don't you love the BBC? And Al Jazeera. Good news, actually. Good, solid news. About you, BBC. You know, when I talk to a lot of my students, they don't watch what I used to watch. You know, I used to grow up watching This Week with David Brinkley. Serious news, man. On Sundays, right? They don't. Most students don't watch that. They don't even watch TV. They don't watch what I'm on, which is heartbreaking, but it's true. They don't watch what I'm on, right? So they don't even know who I am, and they see me in front of them. But you know, they're into podcasts, and they get news from Twitter, or they look at their Instagram feeds. Does anybody get news on Facebook at all?
YouTube.
Yeah.
YouTube.
So here's an interesting thing about YouTube. I came up to Ithaca to speak at Cornell a couple of years ago, and I had a few hours to kill. So what do you do when you have a few hours to kill in Ithaca? You get a tattoo, So I got a tattoo. So I get this tattoo, and it's a captive audience, right? Like, I can't go anywhere. He can't go anywhere. So for 3.5 hours. So we have a conversation. I tend not to tell people what I do because that just creates conversation, right? But I asked a very simple question: where do you get your news from? And he said, YouTube. And I said, but do you really get what's happening when you get your news from YouTube? Because they just kind of send you down the rabbit holes a little bit. And he said, yeah, but there are certain people that I really like. And I follow people that I really like. And that is where we are today. We follow who we like. We follow who makes sense to us. And it's okay that we're in our silos because it feels good, right? It feels good to have your bias confirmed. We all have bias. Let's just get that off the tip. We all have bias. And it feels good in many ways to stay in this place. But that is what's happening, because if you stay there, how do I intersect that? If you watch YouTube and get your news from YouTube, how does what I have to say get into that, unless I got a YouTube channel? I do have a YouTube channel, but I don't do videos like that, right? I don't. So how do I get to you if that's where you get your news? And that is a huge challenge for us today, because the media does fit into this equation in very specific ways. It's a high choice media environment, and the proliferation of partisan news outlets certainly bears this out. The partisan outlets, many that depict the opposite party in the most harsh terms, will talk about news and relate news sometimes in the harshest possible language. They're fascists, they're communists, socialists, they're terrible, right? That's really what this dialogue has become today. And it's interesting because of particular interest to me in the work that I do is there are two things. One, the effect that this might have on how we gather, again, the civic spaces. But also one of the things that's happened is the decrease in religiosity in this country, right? Successive generations don't go to church like they used to. What's happened? American religiosity has been declining for decades. It's produced generational patterns that underline religious decline elsewhere in the West. Each successive cohort is less religious than the preceding one. And when I look at places like Harlem, where I live, Harlem, Washington Heights, I think about what's happened to all those churches. Right? Congregations from across the country are facing waning numbers. A Gallup poll reported in 2020, membership at religious centers dropped below 50% for the first time in history. US church membership was 73% when Gallup first measured in 1937, remained near 70% for the next 6 decades, before beginning a steady climb around the turn of the 21st century. Over the past 2 decades, the percentage of Americans who do not identify with any religion has grown from 8% in 98 to 2000 to 13% in 2008 to 2010, and over 21% in the last few years. Now, when I walk around my neighborhood, I think about churches like St. Philip's Episcopal, which actually has real importance to Cornell. It was designed by, I have to say, a brother, Fertner W. Tandy, an African-American member of my fraternity, a jewel of my fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, which was founded here, and the first African-American registered architect in the state of New York. He designed this church that had, up until a few years ago, thousands of members, thousands of parishioners. It's down to under 200 now. The church where Malcolm X's family held his funeral, it was the only church that would hold his funeral, was torn down for luxury housing. So our religiosity and the decrease in religiosity across the country has also had important changes to the physical space. Not only do we find different ways to gather and organize, but those places we used to gather and organize are now gone. So these factors and more, move my attention on how to deal with the macro trends and the micro impacts in small d, democratic organizing, mobilization, and the building of coalitions. As I said, I spent a lot of time in education policy and reform. You had Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, who then as a candidate espoused anti-CRT, critical race theory language, right? Rode a wave of critical race theory anger and defeated the former DNC chair, Terry McAuliffe, for governor of Virginia. And then an NBC News study revealed that this is happening on an incredible scale. And in fact, in Texas is always interesting. In Texas, librarians were told that they face increasingly hostile work environments and pressure to preemptively pull books that might draw complaints. Bans in Texas and elsewhere also limit reading material and lesson plans containing content referring to LGBTQ identity, and we've heard what's happening in Florida with Don't Say Gay legislation. Back in Texas, a small sampling of 1,200 school districts found 86 formal requests to remove books from libraries last year. The vast majority coming during the final months of last year, just before the November election. Back in February, an Axios report titled "New Rules Are Limiting How Teachers Can Teach Black History." That article documented the banning of teaching of critical race theory and limits, which some state-supported institutions can discuss about the nation's racial past. And as I mentioned, we know what's happening in Florida with Governor DeSantis. If you watch the confirmation hearings of Ketanji Brown Jackson, do you remember some of the questioning? Attempting to link her to critical race theory and anti-racism curriculum in K-12 education. Those attacks weren't just meant to be provocative. They were meant to engage an angry electorate or constituency, these parents, right? In that hearing, Senator Blackburn from Tennessee said Judge Brown Jackson supports teaching kids that they can choose their gender and teaches them about so-called white privilege. What's more, this progressive indoctrination pushes an anti-racist education program on white families. So this line of attack and others is a strategy to mobilize parents in this very hyper-local school board level. It's a tactic, honestly, that is actually quite old. It goes back before Brown versus Board of Ed. It is a pre-Brown tactic that African-American families used to organize parents. You can look back in folks like Ella Baker, who ran the NAACP in New York City, to organize parents to get the districts to be more inclusive, as you had waves of African-American migrants from South coming north. You had a wave of West Indian migrants coming into New York City. They were teachers that simply did not want to teach these children. And African-American parents came together to push back. What happened? At some point, other communities co-opted these tactics and have used them to actually take away some of the opportunities that have been fought for all of these decades. So hand-wringing around what CRT is and isn't is important, but it really misses the point. Because when you bring the Florida law together, when you think about, yes, CRT and the book banning, when you add to that the hundreds of bills across the country and state legislatures suppressing the right to vote, which we've been hearing so much about, which is not by any means over, right? When you bring all of these things together, we have to acknowledge that there is a broader strategy. None of this can be disconnected. One thing cannot be disconnected from the other. They all sort of work together. And this is where civic engagement becomes incredibly important at all levels. Do you know how many school boards there are in this country? Almost 14,000. That's almost 14,000 venues to do this work. But are we doing this work? That's the challenge. Over almost 14,000, right? Let's talk about judges for a second. I know I'm professor. I'll never do it the way you could, but talk about judges for a second. right? Democrats generally not moved by judges. That's just not something that Democrats mobilize around, generally speaking. Maybe we do now. I hope we do now. But there are occasions I'm going to put my partisan hat on, and I'll tell you well ahead of time when I'm going to do that. So I hope we are now. But it's something that historically has not driven the party. It's something that's just, we don't have urgency around that. But we should. Now, Joe Biden's no slouch. He made 42 lower court appointments within his first year, which topped his predecessors since Kennedy, and front-loaded a lot of nominations where he could focus on courts that had no opposition party senators. So at this point, he's nominated by any measure the most demographically diverse judges that we've seen. But the Trump effect is real. He leaves the White House having appointed more than 200 judges to the federal bench, including nearly as many powerful federal appeals court judges in 4 years as Barack Obama appointed in 8. Trump stands out for the large number of federal appeals court judges he appointed in only 4 years. When it comes to the nation's 13 federal appeals courts, he appointed 54 federal appellate judges in 4 years. And we know the impact he had on the Supreme Court. He appointed a smaller number, and we can imagine it's a smaller share of non-white federal judges than any other recent president. And more than a quarter of currently active federal judges are now Trump appointees. Think about that. So when you think about that, think about the years prior and how these conversations and arguments around gerrymandering come to fruition. How these conversations around voter suppression and where these cases are being tried, why that matters, right? Now let's look at some party politics. Now, I love Barack Obama. I do. I admit it. I do. That's my dude, you know. But one thing that he did do, and I sort of saw this a lot before I became executive director of the State Democratic Party, but certainly during and after. He and Bernie Sanders did something that really hurt the party itself, intentionally or not, but it created a problem. Where Barack Obama ran around the Democratic Party. He wasn't sort of the party guy, like that Hillary was the sort of party institutional candidate, right? He sort of ran around the party. And what did he create for himself? What was the name of the organization? You all know it, right? What was the organization he created for the Obama organization? Obama for America. Sound right? Anyway, what's interesting about that is essentially he created this proprietary organization to sort of help him get elected. And by doing so, ran around the party. And then Bernie Sanders runs against it, right? And I understand why he did it. I'm not questioning that. But Bernie running against it, Barack running around it, what does that mean? That means that the party infrastructure can't do the work that it's supposed to do, which is get everybody down ballot elected, right? So we've lost that ground game. So everything from the Affordable Care Act to countless other policies that you would want to be promoted at the local level, there's no way to bring that to you, the voter. And this became an even bigger problem because by the time he left office, the Democrats lost about 1,000 seats in legislatures across the country. 1,000. Republicans controlled 56% of the country's 7,383 state legislative seats. Right? That becomes problematic. Why? Because what's being debated in these state houses? Everything from choice to election law, right? And going back to an earlier point, curriculum. Right? So you could see, therefore, how important it is, or it has been, for the ground game to be in place to sort of push out all of this messaging. It is true. President in office typically has a problem in the midterms the next 2 years, right? We know that. Clinton famously had a problem 2 years after he was elected, right? But this was actually a bit worse. And we can see it's not just in Congress, it's also in these state legislatures. So the ground game gets damaged considerably, can't raise money. And the party is itself an organization. It's not just a collection of Democrats. It's actually a director, it's a chair, it's state committee members. My direct constituents were 300 state committee members and the county chairs of all of New York's counties. How many counties are there in the state of New York that you might know? Thank you. God bless you, man. That's awesome. And I've been to all 62 twice. Love this state. And when you had, those were my direct constituents. And when I tell you that they were upset and angry because they didn't have the tools to do what they needed to do on the ground, I can't overstate how much that, how significant that was, right? When I would get together with other EDs and state party chairs across the country, we would have the same conversation. Don't have the money to do the work that we want to do. Now, add into this social media. I don't even know what to say about that. I actually had a moderated a panel discussion about 2 weeks ago on social media in criminal justice. And I have a friend who runs an organization called AI for the People. AI for the People. What's interesting about this conversation, and it's something that I talk about in the class I teach on police reform, is that what technology and social media have done, we talked about the silos earlier, right? But what it's also done is had this incredible disparate impact on communities of color. Think about facial recognition software to begin with. By the way, don't do stealth checkout because they got your face and all your information. You know that, right? They got you. They got you coming and going, right? Self-checkout, don't do it. But this facial recognition software, why is that critical for us to understand and try to fix and address? Because more often than not, that technology doesn't pick up darker hues of skin. So what happens? You have a lot of folks being stopped, arrested, taken into custody because of some technology that doesn't read my face properly. ShotSpotter, does anybody know what that is? ShotSpotter is a technology where it's used a lot in New York City, where if there is a gun that goes off, the police can send a unit to that location to investigate. Great. It doesn't really know the difference between a gun and a firecracker. So we all have also done readings and research on the inherent bias in algorithms, right? The concern is that you have folks in Silicon Valley writing software, creating technology that sends police into Black neighborhoods clear across the country, right? And we are having problems having a conversation around criminal justice reform, especially as we have a mayor in the city of New York, who I know him, I like him, but he's talking about being tough on crime and bringing back units that prior mayors have gotten rid of, right? He's thinking about he's doing this. And frankly, he would not be able to have the political capital he has to do it if he were not a Black Democrat, frankly. But look how difficult it is now, particularly in this environment, to have this real conversation about what social media and technology is doing to communities and how it's still dividing us. So how do we think about new voices and new venues? And I'll tell you why I'm encouraged about the future. I am encouraged because I see what's happening in organized labor across the country. Amazon, Starbucks, they organized an Apple store in Atlanta, right? there was a report coming out of this institution that talked a lot about nail salon workers, right? You have unions organizing nail salon workers, car wash workers, McDonald's, right? That even as we're thinking differently about work, the basics are still there. People are working, they're getting taken advantage of, particularly if they're immigrants. And they need to have representation. And that is still critically important for us. One of the ways in which I am encouraged by social media, as much as I just poo-pooed it, I'm encouraged by social media because I have a friend named Mark Skidmore. Mark has been in the social media environment since Obama. He's worked for Obama. He's worked for Elizabeth Warren for 10 years. He worked for Biden. And basically, many of the social media ads that you may get come from his organization. So we're tracking you now, by the way. Turn your phones off because we're tracking you. We are actually. But because you know this, right? We know whether or not you voted. You know that, right? We can tell whether you voted or not. We know that. We can tell your proclivity in terms of donating and volunteering and things like that. All this really great data that we can get on you. We've been using it for you and against you for a long time. So just be mindful of that. But that said, Mark has done great work in being both great at mobilizing through social media, but also being responsive. In the few years that he's done his work, and he was on a panel with me the other day, and he said, campaigns have invested as much as $600 million in his company to do online ads and voter mobilization. It's an incredible amount of money by political campaigns, independent expenditures to try to move votes. I am confident that more folks like him will be able to help us organize in these spaces. One of the challenges with that is I talked about religiosity earlier. One of the things that social media has been able to do, in fact, is small d democratize social movements, right? If we don't have the church to go to and the pastor to say, we're going to take this, we're going to do this in this day and march in this place, social media has been able to do that quite considerably, has helped us do that, and it is small d democratize the process. I like what's happening with mayors across the country. We're seeing a lot of young mayors. I mentioned the mayor of New York City, but there's so many other mayors, Mayor Cleveland, that's doing some incredible work. Stacey Abrams, with the 50, well, she's bringing back the 50-state strategy within the state of Georgia. With Democrat or Republican, that is the way to organize. You go meet people where they are. It's just that simple. I did an event at Yates County a couple of years ago, and the parting gift was squash. They're all farmers, right? You walk away with squash, and I'm saying, who gives away squash at an event? But that is their community. That's what they do. Not enough of us go there and meet people where they are, and that is incredibly important. We have to contest in every seat. That is critically important. When I talk about 14,000 school districts, you know how many law enforcement agencies there are in this country? About 18,000. So when you're trying to organize around issues like criminal justice reform, similar to what you're doing around curriculum, it can't just be one national strategy. You have to go local, because every law enforcement agency probably has a community council attached to that. In New York City, every single police precinct has a community council attached to that precinct. You can be organizing at that level in so many more places across the country. I want to just stop, well, not stop, I'll just say a couple quick things and then we'll take some questions. Relational organizing is what we're doing next, right? Because of the breakdown in some of the institutions, we don't get to gather in a lot of places anymore. We're doing a lot of relational organizing. There's an author, a scholar named Betsy Sinclair that does a lot of work on social networks. It's not her program, but it is a related program where where the best influencer is not an elected, it's me, your neighbor, right? It's your friend. And trying to kind of engage those networks and have those folks go out. You know, it's like the old Prel commercial. Now you won't remember that. You tell two friends and I'll tell two friends and so on and so on and so on, right? That's the way this works. Now we pay for those programs. It's a paid program, but that is sort of this next wave where it's not so top down. It is much more grassroots, and that's happening in more and more places across the country. One more quick point on that, on going local. Get involved in your party organization, whether you're Republican or Democrat. Get involved in your party organization. Everybody wants to run for office, and that's great. But as I said, parties are organizations. There are 300 state committee members that are part of the New York State Democratic Party. Why aren't you one of those state committee members, right? Why aren't you one of those county leaders? There are so many folks from the Bernie camp who hated what the party was doing. Wasn't my fault. That was party rules. But I tried to work with them as much as I can. And wanting to change the rules, they came into the party and they're running for office. There are folks that are county committee members, state county chairs that are now having an impact, not just on the outside, but within the organization itself. And that's critically important. I'll just end here and take questions, but I'll say this. And the Dean, you may appreciate this. In my spare time, I listened to a lot of lectures, and I was listening to Richard Feynman, noted physicist. I know the Dean would appreciate this. And he was trying to answer a question about how something worked. And he said, I can't really answer that question, because if I answer that question, we have to come to some understanding of what this means and what that means. Bottom line is, if we don't have common truths, we can't really have a conversation that is meaningful to either of us. And I stopped there and to reflect on that in our society today, and reflect on Professor Konvitz's own words when he talked about American ideals. And he was talking about the Bible. Now, I bring this up because I still have the Bible that my grandmother taught me on. He said, the Bible is inner and outer oriented, concerned with individual blessedness and individual salvation, but with health and the welfare of society. So where is the stress? Generally, the agreement is on group consciousness, that corporate personality of the church. That's what predominates. The worth and responsibility of the individual soul, and how each soul should be judged separately and apart. You don't see that as much, but there were some like Ezekiel and Jeremiah that put that stress back into the text. And it begs the question, what of me will survive? There is always this tension between my personal, individual cares and concerns and what I'm going to do for society. And we saw that dialogue a lot over the last 2 years, right? Mask mandates, vaccine mandates, this tension between personal freedoms and societal goals and ideals. But I remember this frequently. When I dig a little deeper, a lot of these conversations around personal freedom and parental freedom are just proxies for other things. Proxies for race, proxies for gender, proxies for I don't like you, you don't like me. The question is, how do we get back and have this conversation where we are meeting each other in the middle, having a common dialogue, where we understand where each other is coming from. The truth is, as much as I can talk about the venues that this takes place in, the people like Stacey Abrams and others who are doing this work, it really is all of you. It's all of you in the individual platforms you have. As students, on your own social media platforms, right? Because I know y'all have more followers than I do. So on all your individual platforms, that is where you make the difference. You really are the new voice. And you have to choose the venue and the platform that works for you, and then just go do it. I did, and I had no real guidance on how to do it. I'd kind of just stepped out on faith. And here I am today. And I trust my fate is in your hands, because when I'm trying to collect Social Security, you're going to be the one I'm going to call for my benefits when they don't come in the mail, right? So we have to do the right thing and train you the right way, and look at you as lamps and not mirrors. It's not about us at this point. It's really about you. So I'll stop there and happy to take any questions that you all have.
thanks very much for fantastic remarks. We have some time for questions. Before I go to the in the room, the online people, you can put in questions in the Q&A. So we'll relay those into the room, but we can start with in the room questions. And I see one up in the back there.
Hi, my name is Konvitz, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming to speak today. It really means a lot to my family, and my dad's so excited that you're here today to speak, and I'm honored to be able to come and listen to you. And I just had a question about being more involved in your parties. One of the things I noticed in my high school experience was there wasn't really a good awareness program on how high school students and how the younger generation could really get involved with local politics. I really didn't have an idea of how my local systems worked growing up. I was wondering what your opinions on that were, how to get more kids involved, whether that's through social media or otherwise.
Thank you for welcoming me here. And I didn't either. I didn't know how to get involved at all. And in fact, my freshman year here, I never forget, I was still not old enough to vote, and I was walking with my friend Andy Velez into, it used to be called RPU. What is it now? Well, you would know. It's on North Campus, the union, the student union. RPCC.
Yeah, RPCC.
Still RPU? Oh, fantastic. And I remember there was a news ribbon at the time, not social media, because we didn't have internet then. So there was a news ribbon that said David Dinkins had been elected the first Black mayor of the city of New York. And we looked at each other, I never forget it. We looked at each other and said, look at what we did. He couldn't vote, I couldn't vote, but it was something about the collective us, right? That us, these communities that had come together to fight for all this time to get him elected. I'm saying that to say that it was that moment that really encouraged me to think more about public service. I did not have a path to it. What had happened when I got my first job working at 1199, and they said, go organize. And they put me in a place to do that. It wasn't necessarily connected to Democratic or Republican politics, but I will tell you that whether you're near a political club, Democratic or Republican club, Democratic in my case, Democratic club, union event, or if you are, honestly, if you're just going to tenant meetings, you gotta get local. Presidential campaigns are incredibly sexy and attractive. Most of the policy that impacts your day-to-day life happens on a state and local level, but that's where we find also the lowest voter turnout. And so just get local. If there is a building where tenants are being organized, get involved in that. It is incredible to be able to connect the work to individual stories of the people you'll interact with day to day. One thing I didn't say, I actually ran for office once back in 2010. I ran for state senate here in New York, in my area. And my life has changed since then. I lost badly, but my life changed, and I knew it was going to lose. I was going up at an incumbent. But my life changed after that, because every block that I walk by now, every building that I see has a memory. I remember the people, I remember the issues, and I remember how I felt and what I said and what needs to happen next and who to talk to about that. There's nothing that can really, even if you don't run for office, if it's a tenant organization, just get involved in it. They would love to have your help. Any other? Sir?
One project software government native arts and sciences. Joined here by Luke Jackson.
Luke Jackson, President of Research Science Council.
Thank you, sir.
We're actually the president and VP elects at all my office chapter.
We'll talk to you.
Great presentation, bro.
Thank you.
Essentially, I was just asking, considering all of the things you said in terms of like voter suppression, like what are your projections of I guess the upcoming election?
I'm nervous because the question is, what are my projections for the upcoming elections given the voter suppression? I'm nervous. I'm nervous that we don't have enough weapons in place to fight. What Stacey did in Georgia and nationalizing her campaign to sort of fight all of these voter suppression bills great and it's important. And another friend of mine, Cliff Albright, who's also a Cornell grad, is one of the co-founders of Black Votes Matter, and also in Atlanta. And he's out there doing this similar work across the country. And I think there are enough voters that are anticipating the hurdles that will make a plan. And remember what the sort of Biden make a plan to vote, we kept talking about that day after day after day, and it's stuck. And I want us to be able to do similarly in this cycle. I am a little concerned though, because it was a lot in and I want to say, I hate to say this, but a lot in a short period of time. I don't think a lot of folks were prepared to fight. But again, I think if these organizations are out on the ground early enough, we'll be able to sort of overcome that. That's the hope, yeah.
I just wanted to thank you for coming
My pleasure.
and giving your presentation.
Can't hear you.
Just wanted to give you a great thanks for coming
My
and
pleasure,
giving your
brother.
presentation. I really like your point about the declining religiosity that we see in our communities. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I campaigned for Stacey Abrams, and a lot of the campaigning that I did was in churches and around the communities that gathered around churches. Do you think that we're seeing religion being replaced by social media? And if so, where does social media lie in terms of, the base of the Black community, which is the church?
No, it's interesting because I did a panel with some ministers, including one who heads Abyssinian Baptist Church. If you don't know that church, is a major church in Harlem, who's a former pastor was Adam Clayton Powell Jr. And I was on this panel talking about this very issue. What is the role of clergy in this coming civil rights movement? The truth is there's obviously still a very strong role. It may not necessarily be church-based and neighborhood-based, and I think that's what social media has done. It's taken the geographic restrictions off of mobilization. It's still important because you still need to elect people in districts, in specific areas. But if somebody's saying, hey, we're gonna get together at this street at this time, you put it out there and people just show up, and that's power. Those are signs of strength. We saw that in after George Floyd. And what's also interesting is the ability not just to mobilize, but to get information out there, right? So, the fact that we even know about George Floyd, why? Because it was on a cell phone video. Eric Garner, because of his cell phone video, right? And Martin Arbery. And that has changed not just what institutions say about what happens, particularly the police, right? It's changed the way they operate, but it's changed how we respond. And I think that, and it's also created something that's really important, which is a sense of urgency. My mentor used to tell me, people vote for one of two reasons, pride or anger. But I would also say on top of that, that fear is one of the biggest drivers of mobilization, but also just to be able to create that sense of urgency around issues. And I think that's one of the things that social media has been able to bring to us, because it's shed a light on so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, yes.
So my name is Noah Campbell from the ILR school.
Hey, Noah.
So my question is, a lot of this lecture has been about organization. How would you respond if someone came to you and said that they understand the importance of organization, they understand its place, especially in politics, but they can't sort of find themselves really associating with either of the main two political parties, because either because they're a traditional moderate, or because they have sympathies with either party on certain issues, but it's only both parties have 40% of their issues, and neither gets a majority even of how they feel.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think there's a couple of things. One of the trends over the last few years, particularly since the Obama campaigns, is that there are all of these other organizations that are coming to fruit, that are being built up, that are, I don't want to say replacing, but are doing some of the similar work that parties would do. So organizations like Indivisible, anybody heard of Indivisible, and Arena, like all of these organizations that are not parties, right? These aren't party organizations. These are smaller organizations that are engaged in some of this more relational organizing. They'll say, hey, why don't you come to a meeting tonight? Why don't you come to a meeting? And we'll not only talk to you and teach you the sort of nuts and bolts about being in office, getting in office, and how to push issues, but in many ways also recruit you to run for office. And that's something that I, for full disclosure, I've been involved with another organization over the last couple of months, recruiting some people to run for congressional seats across the country. And it's not connected to the party, and in some instances they're running against incumbents in primaries. But in my view, it is important to get more diverse for the folks running. But the overall point is that there are a lot of smaller organizations that are not party, but are issue-based, and in some cases geographic, whether it's focused in New York or other states, where you can get engaged. I would also add to that, and it goes back to an earlier point, if there are issues that you care about, like you care about education, just go to a school board meeting. It doesn't matter what party you're. I mean, it does if you decide to run for school board in some cases, but just get involved in even those local meetings, because they've become so contentious today. They're usually sometimes pretty sleepy affairs, but recently they're not. But you can even start there and get organized. It's just being very local. And I totally get the point about the parties not being responsive. The Democrats are being accused. Whatever you think about Republicans is one thing, but the Democrats, the party that I belong to and have worked in, we've become increasingly a party of coastal elites. Right? And even something like the Bernie Sanders, I'll say this out of full disclosure. Somebody asked me why is it that Black folks weren't really engaging Bernie Sanders? And I said, well, part of it might be the corporate thing. And said, what are you talking about? Well, he's often viewed as anti-corporate, anti-public private sector. So in the Black community, some of the private sector leaders are our heroes. If you were young and had a Jet magazine growing up, I don't know, y'all wouldn't know Jet magazine, but a Jet magazine, and you put that, it was on your uncle's coffee table. And in the magazine was a list of all of the private sector African-American leaders who were making moves. So they're heroes in our community. If you tell me you want to be anti-private sector, it's like, Black people want to be rich too. We just don't want this game to be rigged against us. And so all of these nuances with where the party's going and who the party's representing, they're concerning to me too. But I think but I'm old school, so I'm gonna stick to partying. For so many of us of color, it's been a source of political and economic empowerment. But for others that don't align with any of the ideals or platforms of either party, smaller organizations like Indivisible, Arena, find folks who are creating independent expenditures to organize and recruit people for office. There are a lot of them out there, and I'm happy to work with you to find one that works for you. Happy to. Sir?
Thanks again, great remarks, really appreciate it. You talked about seeing the Trump signs on your drive on the way up. I came from the West, I saw plenty of Trump signs as well in the countryside, and I did see a Trump 2024 sign.
Oh, you did? Okay.
With an F-bomb dropped onto the sign. So they're definitely getting aggressive. And that gets to the question, so much of presidential politics and even state politics and the divisiveness we're seeing there is driven by shall we say, the political map being tilted in favor of rural communities, rural counties, right? The agrarian myth embedded in our Constitution and lots of state constitutions. So for those who are more progressively inclined, looking for a more liberal public policy agenda, sort of fighting against that sort of rural bias built into our state and federal constitutions, how can you impact rural areas when you don't vote there, you don't live there? How can you mobilize to change minds there? Because certainly at the federal and even state level, we need to get the pendulum swinging back the other way. How do you impact that?
And I'll add another layer to that. As the head of a party, it was incredibly difficult to recruit candidates to run there.
Yes, yes.
Because you're trying to get a Democrat to run against a Republican, and that Democrat and that Republican aren't that far off, right? And you have to deal with that. I'm saying that to say that if you look at Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania, right? There were a lot of folks that did not want him running because of his positions that were too far, too moderate, too centrist, right? So you have to think about, so you have to sort of make this calculation. Is it more important to have him in the House as a moderate Democrat? Or are you going to focus more on ideology? And that honestly, I don't think there's a hard and fast answer to that. You know, I go back and forth on this personally because I do care about ideology. And I don't mean, you know, I'm not a purist, but, you know, we got to be talking about issues in a way that, you know, that creates that sense of urgency, that says to people, like, we care about you, we care about this. So I think that piece right there is what had been lacking, that for so long, Democrats ignored those areas. And now we're having to come back and have this conversation again under very different circumstances. And I go back to Stacey, and I talk about her because she's a friend, but you know, it's not just her. There are folks that are doing this all the time. And even, you know, as I said, when I went to this event at Yates County, 25, you can travel 25 miles before you find somebody that looked like me. But I'm there trying to recruit candidates to run. And I'm there trying to be a voice of the party. And, you know, and I, to some extent, believe that someone that is part of my party, even if we disagree on some things, will likely see things more my way than not. And I have to take that chance. But that is the existential problem. Like, do we really hold folks accountable in terms of ideology? And it's not just about being a purist, but like, really, do you have an ideology that represents where we need to go as opposed to where we've been? And are you able to carry voters with you that way? And are we actually even in those spaces anymore? Are we going to those communities and having this conversation? That just showing up, I gotta tell you, just showing up is 2/3 of it. And that's something that the party had neglected for a long time. Yeah. And I'll just say this really quickly, just about ideology. Bernie Sanders won a primary in West Virginia, not talking about bringing coal back. If he can have that conversation, we all can have that conversation. You know what I mean? Like, it's not rocket science. You just got to do the work. Sir.
It is. Well, I mean, it's not only that, Basil, but I mean, the other thing you have to look at, and this is becoming increasingly important to me, or at least I consider this a lot more than I used to. In having a majority in the House and or the Senate is critical, right? So I mean, if it's got a really narrow margin like it is now, and you get a moderate or even a more conservative Democrat elected to a House seat, I mean, that's critical just in terms of getting a majority and controlling the body of the legislature, right?
Well, I mean, to think about Manchin and Sinema now, right? And the problems that are inherent in that, it's tough. And this is, but again, I know it from a point of view of just trying to recruit the Democrat to run, first and foremost. But then what we're seeing now is the after effect, the aftermath of that. And, but I also think there's another issue here too. And I've said this publicly. I actually said this about impeachment, although I said this about impeachment, and I'll say it again in this context, because I've talked about how Democrats have a lot of power and we don't use it. As a Black man, I could never understand having power and having the luxury to not exercise it. That can't happen. So how do we tell voters, how do I tell these gentlemen, tell that gentleman, to go out there and vote for us to get this power and then not use it? I can't in good conscience do that. And so my point is that even more so than the actual numbers in terms of majority and minority in these houses, it's also being able to get the power. This is what we work really hard to do, get this power and then be able to actually use it in times that really matter. And, you know, I understand the concerns that Manchin and Sinema and others have, but when it's your agenda at stake and you are the president of the United States, you know, you've got a lot of power too. Got to exercise that. Yes.
I was really interested by your discussion of how organizations sort of shifted online into social media and how you think like that's the role in the future. But I was thinking about how like where I'm from in Rochester, like during the pandemic and everything, they were really struggling to get people vaccinated. And one of the most effective things that they found was to start holding vaccination clinics in churches. So I was wondering if you think there's going to be a continuing role in those sort of community and religious institutions going forward, because there's sort of like a generational like ingrained trust, you know, like those sort of things. Say, like, do you think that's going to still be important going forward, or do you think that's going to like fade as social media becomes more dominant?
To me, churches will always be important because folks will still congregate. You know, if it's 2,000 or 200, folks will still congregate, and particularly in communities of color, this is still. Members of the clergy are still incredibly important voices in our community, even if the physical space is not continued, is not still there. I'm a Mason, a Freemason. Everybody says, oh, my grandfather was a Mason, because they don't expect young people to be Mason. Well, I'm not exactly young anymore, but I became a Mason 20 years ago this year, actually. And people say, well, you know, I didn't realize somebody so young would be a Mason. It's like these older folks that wear black and don't go to meetings and don't tell anybody they're going to meetings. And I'm saying that to say that that's partly because this big institution, which used to be Freemasonry, where there were African-Americans, prominent African-Americans, a member of that organization, the membership is dwindling. But I think the respect for what those institutions did in our community and the people that came out of those institutions still resonates. So the respect is there. It's the question is, where do young people, where do you go for your marching orders, so to speak? Would you go to the church? Is it because you went to church on Sunday and the pastor, or during the week and the pastor said, we got to do this, this, and that? Or are you seeing it on your phone for the first time? And what is the trigger? And who is that trigger? Is it going to be a member of the clergy? Is it going to be your friend that's sitting next to you? Is it going to be a parent or another community member or a celebrity? It's usually not celebrities, but you know, is it going to be, who is that trigger? And that's what we need to figure out. And that's always what's so really difficult. What is going to turn your intention into behavior? Yes, Professor.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So I wanted to bring back in the labor movement and the really encouraging and interesting surge in interest in the labor movement and organizing, also by young people, right? I mean, that's really encouraging, and ask you to connect up your thoughts about, you know, the attacks on the labor movement, right, to undermine social organizing for the common good, and now this kind of resurgence that we're seeing, particularly among young people in all kinds of areas, whether it's tech or retail or, you know, Starbucks, Amazon, et cetera, and how that links up to the idea of how people vote.
Right.
And because the Black church was so important because it stood for organizing for the common good, for civil rights, for labor organizing. It wasn't the fact that it was a church per se, because you got plenty of churches, you know, right-wing positions in terms of women's rights, reproductive rights, et cetera.
Right.
It was the nature of religion connected to civil rights and labor. So,
yes.
You know, what is your thinking about that?
And let me add another point to that. Schools were similar.
Right.
Schools are not just places where teachers and students meet. They are centers of social, moral, political reproduction, right? Mm-hmm. And they are, you know, what we teach and what we don't teach is both a political statement and a moral value declaration, right? And so what I think has happened, and to connect it to some of the points that were made, or questions from earlier, one of the basic functions of organizing and mobilizing and campaign work is storytelling, building the narrative and generating a message from that. And one of the things that social media has really allowed us to do is tell stories. that is a key, that's an incredibly important and powerful tool. But one of the things that I was talking to you about, Mark Skidmore, my buddy earlier, that's what he's really focused on, telling stories through social media. So that, you know, look, if we were to do a TV ad to tell the same story, it would cost us millions of dollars in New York City, which is the biggest media market in the country, right? But it's so much cheaper and easier to do it through social media. So you get it on your phone, it's on IG, it's on Twitter, wherever the case is. It's the storytelling that has really been so compelling. We can tell stories about how young people, and basically even essential workers, had to go out in the pandemic. Let's think about this. You all heard about the shooting in the New York subways a couple of weeks ago, right? Think about it. I had students who didn't want to come to class that night because they were nervous. But there were hundreds of thousands of people that, even hearing that news, still had to get on that subway and go to work. They do not have the luxury of saying, I'm going to stay home. And my point here is that as those stories became available to us, when we started to hear stories about essential workers, we started to hear stories about delivery workers being abused, being robbed. We started to hear stories and see and listen to nail salon workers tell their stories. My good friend Stu Applebaum, right, who does a lot of this work, particularly. We just heard there was a settlement with 32BJ, right? It's the maintenance workers, the endowment and so on. And so when you hear about how they had to come to work when everybody could stay home, when you had when they were in danger, that storytelling became incredibly important. And I think, interestingly enough, young people resonates with young people more than anything that we have ever done. And that storytelling creates that sense of urgency. It creates that power, and it forces you to mobilize. It forces you to go out and do something about it. And I think whether it's focused on elections or it's focused on labor organizing, it's working. And in fact, one I think I would say, and I haven't said this before, but I would say it here, it probably, if I were to recommend to you something to do outside of getting people elected, it's to focus on the labor organizing. Because it's not about party, it's about the people that are involved. And it's about, making sure that, there's fairness in the workplace. That might be a really good way to sort of get immediately engaged. That is really, it's partisan in one sense, but it's really about those people and thinking about, how they work. So I think the storytelling has been really important and critical.
I just follow up from one thing in terms of connecting it up, that when people organize in labor unions and they see how everybody benefits
Yes.
and the common good, how will they vote in elections? It may well be going back to the notion of the links between the labor movement and the Democratic Party.
Those historic links are incredibly important. It's the concern, and I do think that when we think about older coalitions and sort of Jesse's Rainbow Coalition and so on, this was paramount that we make sure we had these relationships. But it has suffered, and it's Democrats are to blame in part for that as well. As the parties became more elite and coastal, and it sort of turned away from all that we used to do, all that it used to do, to really bring people into the fold. And these were folks who were of color. One of the things, and I'll just say this really quickly, when Obama ran in 2008, I'm sorry, am I really going over it? When Obama ran in 2008, you could think about the Democratic Party in sort of three circles, right? There were people of color, largely Black folks, but not exclusively, but people of color. There were those high income, high educational attainment voters. We give them a derogatory name, latte liberals, limousine liberals. I don't use that term, but that's how people say it. And working class voters, many unionized, but not all. When Obama ran in 2007, when he announced in 2007, that first year, all of his fundraising came from a very specific group, right? And his ascendance, we knew about him and the sort of organization that he created, Obama for America, all that came from one very specific group, those high income, high educational attainment voters. And then what happened in 2008? He wins Iowa. And then he wins South Carolina, and voters are like, hey, who's that guy, right? A lot of African American voters. So he was polling in the single digits among African Americans for that whole year. And then 2008 comes, and then they sort of come over to Obama. Who am I leaving out? Those working class voters never got to him. And I'm not saying that that's his fault. But what I am saying is that since then, at least, at minimum, that's a part of our electorate that Democrats have never really been able to talk to and engage and bring back to that coalition. I don't know if there is a candidate that can do that, but all of you can, because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's those new voices and new venues. It's the labor organizing. It is being on the ground and with all of these folks who look like us and represent us that are struggling day to day. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where you can have that conversation about whether it's party or organization, whatever you're a part of, to say, this is who we are. We care about the work that you do. By the way, if you want to institutionalize these reforms, go vote this way.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Smikle. Thanks all for coming out. See you next year for 2023 Konvitz lecture. Another great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.